Yeah, welcome to another crisp webinar. This time we're concentrating on distilling, which is the first time that we've done that in our series. And rather than looking at the wider world of distilling or specific, or looking at the general distilling technique in Scotch whisky production, we're looking at a really specific topic to do with specialty malts in distilling. So there's a real kind of growing area of interest as distilleries worldwide try to differentiate their products, and lots of the focus in flavour production in distilling, in Scotch distilling, has been on woods policy, a bit around yeast as well, and different fermentation and distillation techniques, but not a huge amount of focus has been placed on the malt itself. And so we're really interested in the world of flavour that malt can provide for different spirits. And so we wanted to do a specific webinar on that topic. You're not going to hear an awful lot from me because we have some far better speakers, and I'm going to introduce them just now. So our first speaker is going to be Rutele from Heriot University, if you'd like to join us. Hello. And Rutele, if you could just quickly introduce yourself and what your role is.
Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Rutele Marciulionyte, and I study whiskey distillation in Heriot University. So together with Crisp Maltings and Holyrood Distillery, we're looking into specialty malt usage in whiskey production.
That's awesome. Okay, and we also have our second speaker, you'll hear from a little later on, but if Jack could also join us on screen, that would be great. And
hello,
Jack,
everyone.
If you could introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Dr. Jack Mayo, Distillery Manager at Holyrood Distillery in Edinburgh.
So we have quite a unique tripartite agreement here between ourselves, Heriot and Holyrood Distillery, because we're all very interested in the idea of using different specialty malts to produce malt flavour in new mixed spirit and matured spirit, and that's really the focus of today's presentation. So we hope that everyone watching around the world gets an awful lot out of it. There are two superb presentations. I'll be dipping in and out as well, and then of course later on, please ask questions. We're going to have about 15 minutes or so at the end for any questions that you've got. Pop them into the Q&A window or into the chat window, and I'll pick those up with our panelists later on. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Rutele for her presentation, and we'll see you later on.
Okay, so hello everyone again, and I'm going to talk about whiskey production using specialty malts, because as I mentioned, with Holyrood Distillery and Crisp Malts, we're trying to understand how malt roasting contributes to flavor and what challenges does it bring to distillation. So to begin with, whiskey is the world's #1 internationally traded spirit. And in Scotland alone, we have 133 working distilleries. So how do they all find their market? If you have your favorite whiskey, ask yourself, why do you like that whiskey? So probably history or packaging or advertising, they're all important, but flavor is one of the main factors when we're choosing. And in whiskey, most flavors come from maturation. So to introduce new flavors, we can use casks which previously held various liquids. And bourbon and sherry casks are the most popular, but we can also use red wine casks, for example, for red berry aromas, even beer casks for more citrusy, hoppy notes. We can use smaller casks for faster maturation, different oak types. Japanese or Mizunara oak is more spicy, American is more vanilla, coconutty. We can use increased toasting or charring, and that's for extra sweetness and spiciness. We can reuse a cask multiple times, but new virgin oak casks provide more oaky and spicy notes. And then spirit flavors are controlled during distillation as well. They depend heavily on where we choose to make the cut for heads, heart, and tails. Pot stills, they yield in more flavors than column stills. And copper, as opposed to steel, can remove unpleasant sulfuric compounds having aroma of rotten vegetables. Then pot stills can be short and fat for harsher spirit. They can be tall and slim for better separation of compounds. Column condensers can be used for effective stripping of the sulfuric compounds, but then worm tubs can be chosen for more meaty-like spirit. And spirit is usually distilled 2 times in Scotland, but extra distillations can purify spirit from congeners even more. So then moving on to fermentation, different flavors can be introduced by choosing particular yeast types and strains, and my colleagues are working on it in ICBD. Then steel washbacks are really easy to clean, but then wooden washbacks, they provide natural pockets for lactic acid bacteria, creating fruitier spirit. Also, short fermentations yield in grainy flavored wort, and extending the timeline increases fruity floral notes due to the same lactic acid bacteria. And then in mashing step, recovered wort can be clear for cleaner or more fruitier taste, but cloudy wort yields nuttier, grainier spirit. And finally, in malting, we can choose to peat or not to peat, the smoke intensity. We can choose peat origin, as Isla peat is known to be more medicinal and Orkney is considered to be more heather-like. And we can choose the grain, barley, rye, wheat, corn, and we can choose grain origin. So knowing that malt whiskey comes from malted barley exclusively, we wanted to deeper investigate the malting process and how we can alter the organoleptic properties of whiskey through malting. But what is malting? So firstly, barley has to be steeped in water for grains to absorb the moisture and plump up. Then they are left to germinate for about 3 to 4 days, and starch is liberated from the cells. Acrospire or sprout elongates inside the grain, and rootlets grow, resulting in green malt. And green malt has to be kiln dried for storage, resulting in kiln malt. So this lightly kiln malt is the primary choice for whiskey production, as it is rich in starch and enzymes. However, in roasting, in brewing, roasting step is often used to deepen the color and to introduce new flavors. So kiln malt can be roasted to yield in amber, brown, chocolate, black malts. Green malt can be roasted to obtain caramel or crystal malt, and also unmalted barley can be roasted. But these specialty malts normally used in brewing only at 2 to 12%, because one, the flavors are very intense, and also fermentable sugars and enzymes are lost during the roasting process. So where do the sugars go then? In temperatures above 50 degrees, sugars and amino acids undergo the Mayo reaction. And this produces colored melanoidin polymers and also a very wide variety of flavor active compounds. So some of them are really pleasant, like furans smell like caramel, pyrones like candy floss, pyrazines can smell like coffee or chocolate, but other ones like oxazoles, wasabi peanuts, thiazoles, grilled prawns, you probably wouldn't want them in your whiskey. And then we rise the temperature, we get caramelization reactions. That's when reducing sugars, they can react and they can be dehydrated in absence of amino compounds. So we produce similar spectrum of compounds, but nothing with nitrogen now. And then we have to carefully control the temperature as above 200 degrees, and that's often used to produce chocolate or black malts. We observe thermal decomposition or pyrolysis. So flavor and color are decomposed, leading to char and dry, ashy, acrid smells. So that brings us to our research objectives. We want to experiment with, firstly, roasting time and temperature to see how it affects the flavor profile. Then how it affects fermentation and alcohol yield, as some of the roasting reaction products are known to be yeast inhibitors. And are those flavors retained through distillation? And are they concentrated during maturation or maybe lost with angel's share? So to get the answers, we began experiments in small scale. And most malt roastings in the literature are done in coffee roasters now on small scales, but we wanted to be more accurate with our temperatures. So we equipped an oven of a gas chromatograph with a rotating drum, and it's capable of holding about half a kilo of malt. So an oven's heating and cooling temperatures where the rate is 30 degrees per minute. So if we have 10-minute roast at 220 degrees, it's actually 6 minutes of heating up, 10-minute roast, and 6 minutes cooling down. And that's why we can have 0-minute roasts, which would be just heating up and cooling down. So we chose to investigate the range from 80 degrees, as it is just slightly above the distilling malt kilning temperature, and up to 220 degrees Celsius, as in higher temperatures we observed carbonization of grains. And time range for us was from 0 minutes to 60 minutes. And we chose 25 points in this range. And normally all of them, they would need to be analyzed in triplicates. So we would have 75 points in total. But we used Design Expert software, a very useful tool for optimizing the analytical workload. And by adding extra points in the corners and the middle, we were able to reduce the number of roasts to 32, still keeping the overall error of the model low. And we roasted standard pot still malt from crisp, and color differences became soon very apparent, but we wanted to investigate flavors further. So we used solid phase microextraction technique with gas chromatography mass spectrometry, and we would put a finely milled sample in a sample vial. We would crimp it, and then when heated, volatiles equilibrate from solid layer to the headspace layer. Then we insert a needle, and needle delivers a special fiber, and volatiles attach to the fiber and forces out more volatiles from the sample. So in this way, using solid phase microextraction, we concentrate the volatiles, improving their detection. So then we flush this fiber into the system, and we get a spectrum similar to this. And then every peak is matched with the library and identified. And then we use flavor databases, and we assign flavors to the molecules. And finally, we group those molecules by flavors into 6 flavor groups created by using the flavor wheel of Scotch Whisky Research Institute. So we get roasted, green, fruity, floral, sulfury sour off flavors, and other off flavors. And we get a graph like this for every sample, but this is only number of compounds, as we aim to quantify volatiles in the further study. So here we have roasting time axis and temperature axis. And in temperatures up until 115 degrees, number of flavor volatiles in samples was quite similar. And then we got an increase of roasted volatiles in temperatures 150 and above. So in this area, flavors were generated through Maillard and caramelization reactions. But at those higher temperatures, what we notice is the flavor decomposition. We get less roasted flavor molecules. So the most abundant chemical groups in those roasted categories, they were pyrazines and furans. And they can provide us with some really attractive aromas like nutty, Nutella, coffee, cocoa, chocolate. And here you're looking at surface response graphs. So we have roasting time axis below and temperature axis on the left. And darker areas represent higher numbers. So most pyrazines were formed in this area from 150 to 185, and that's the Maillard reaction. But furans were formed at a bit higher temperatures, from 185 to 220. And that's Mayo reaction, but also caramelization reaction. So we will measure the concentrations of those compounds and their flavor activity in the future. And then we performed some basic malt analysis. So malt weight decreased with roasting due to loss of moisture and some gases and husk dust. Then cold water extract, showing soluble materials before mashing. It was dropping from 80 degrees to 185 because sugars and amino acids were consumed in the heat-induced reactions. But then at 220, interestingly, the cold water extract rose, possibly because insoluble starches were converted to soluble pyrodextrins. And dextrins can contribute to extract value, but they cannot be fermented. Next, we mashed the malt according to the standard Analytica EBC methods, and we used 50% unroasted malt and 50% roasted. Then we crushed the malt with bench disc mill at pour setting. We added pre-tempered water and continuously agitated at 65 degrees for 1 hour in a mash bath. And then we gravity filtered the mash through filter paper in a funnel and obtained wort of very different colors and smells. And pale ones, sorry, is that? Okay, pale worts have really grassy and green aromas, while darkest ones, they really reminded of coffee. And then in 2 hours, we collected similar amounts of wort from malts roasted up to 185 degrees, but much less for the 220 roasts. So this is because husk became really brittle and it wasn't able to form a good filter bed. And then free amino nitrogen and fermentable sugars, they also decreased with time and temperature as they were used in the Maillard and caramelization reactions. And therefore, we also obtained less of hot water extract. And then wort color, it increased the most at 220 degrees, and it is comparable to the grist color we saw already. And color change in wort can be mostly attributed to melanoidins and conjugated caramel polymers. Then wort made from darker malts was more acidic, as acids were formed in sugar degradation. And then real fermentability is the percentage of the original soluble extract that has been fermented, and also fermentable extract, which is percentage of total extract that has been fermented. They both decreased notably with heavier roasting. So this shows us that we lost some fermentables in roasting reactions, that we produced soluble and insoluble non-fermentable materials, and also maybe some of the reaction products inhibited fermentation. However, this is done with 50% roasted malt inclusion, as it was a standard analysis method. And lower rates would probably be more relevant to distilling. Previous studies in our department, they have demonstrated that even 5% inclusion rate, it's enough to make a significant difference in distilled spirit flavor perception. So therefore, we tested inclusion rates from 0 to 50%. So 0 is just pale malt, and 50% is 50% roasted malt of extreme roast, 220 degrees for 60 minutes. And we measured weight change due to the expelled carbon dioxide. And as you can see, for the first 12 hours, all samples behaved in a similar fashion. But after 72 hours, unroasted malt fermentation here was about 35% more efficient than the 50% roasted malt. Then we looked at original gravity, and wort original gravity was quite similar. But then fermented wash, final gravity was higher for roasted malts. as roasted malts were less fermentable. And then final gravity, less wort was collected from higher roasted malt inclusions. And after first distillation, when we got the low wine volumes, if we look at the same amount of wort, low wines produced with the same amount of wort, it was quite similar, the volume. But the major factor affecting the yield was mash filtration. So we get less volume, we collect less wort, and that's why a graph low wine volume from the same weight of malt, it's a steep decrease. 50% malt inclusion, roasted malt inclusion rate, it yields in 65 less volume of low wines comparing to the pale malt. So we have produced low wines so far, and we will distill those samples to yield in spirit, and we will decide the optimal roasted malt inclusion rate based on the alcohol yield and the profile of flavor volatile. And we will determine the flavor compound concentration in spirit using liquid-liquid extraction and gas chromatography mass spectrometer. So this is done, we put DCM or dichloromethane in our spirit sample, we shake it, we centrifuge it, and then the flavor volatiles are concentrated in the DCM layer, which can be then injected into the gas chromatograph mass spectrometer. And we already analyzed some Holyrood Distillery spirit samples made with chocolate malt. And we were able to identify some molecules with coffee, almond, caramel, or even smoky smell. And this tells us that flavor from the malt can definitely be carried into spirit. So I would like to finish by emphasizing two main points we looked at. We looked at flavor and yield. So we produced some pleasant flavor compounds during roasting. Different compounds were formed at different temperatures. And we will further investigate our concentrations and odor activity. And then for the yield, we saw that mash filtration was impeded in roasted malts above 185 degrees, and less extract and lower fermentability was observed in dark roasts. And finally, we can choose an optimal roasted malt inclusion rate to compromise between flavor and yield. So all this is only first year of a 4-year PhD, so we have a lot of work ahead of us. And I would like to thank Chris Malt, Holyrood Distillery, Scottish Research Partnership in Engineering, and the Macpherson Trust for funding my research. And thank you for listening. This research will also be presented in Worldwide Distilled Spirits Conference in March next year. So if you feel like you want to talk about it, see me there. And I would be happy to answer your questions if you have any. Thank you.
Thanks, Rutele. Thank you very much, Rutele, for that presentation. Absolutely superb. You must be itching to get back into the lab. You've got lots of low wine samples to get through the still, yeah?
Yes.
Brilliant. Okay, so we'll hopefully that's generated some thoughts amongst the people watching. We'll hold questions until the end, until Jack's done his presentation as well. But moving from the lab now into a real world distillery, Dr. Jack Mayo, if you want to pop up.
I'm trying to share my screen as well, Colin, but you've disabled it.
I've disabled it. Okay, well, bear with us while we we have tried to solve this technical conundrum. I think that might do it for you there, Jack.
Got it.
Excellent, good stuff.
With that.
Thank you very much. Yes, that's great. So you're going to take us through the Holyrood approach to flavour. That's great.
I am, yeah. So my style will be a little bit more wizened and bitter than Rutele's, having done my PhD some time ago.
Yes, but tell everybody what your PhD was actually in, Jack.
It was in astrophysics. It was completely unrelated. So it was to do with high redshift quasar evolution. So if anyone wants to talk about that at the end, I'll try and get to that grey matter.
If anyone has any questions about that, then definitely pop them up.
I haven't looked at it for 6 years, so bear with me.
We'll drop off and we'll let you do your presentation, and then I'll catch you at the end. All right.
Great. Okay.
Good stuff.
So hello everyone. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we're applying some of what Rutele's doing into our distillery, and a little bit more about our distillery in general as well, and why we're doing is relatively innovative compared to the rest of the Scotch whisky industry. So I'll give you a little bit of background on the Scotch whisky industry as well, because I know there's probably a few people that are aware of Scotch whisky, don't necessarily know what discerns it from other distilleries around the world, and why we're looking at innovation in this way. So there are a draconian set of rules which dictate what Scotch whisky is. There's only 5 styles of Scotch whisky you can make, and any one distillery can make one of 2 styles, one of which is single malt, the other one is single grain. So the single means it's from one distillery, and grain means it's got unmalted grains in it, and the other one, a single malt, is 100% malted barley. So it has to be malted barley in this case. You can't use malted rye or malted wheat. It has to be malted barley, and you're not allowed to add any exogenous enzymes. So no glucoamylase, no beta glucans, nothing of that sort going in. The rules dictate that you have to use yeast. It doesn't say it has to be Saccharomyces. It can be any style of yeast you want, but you're not allowed to add any bacteria. You can add it through using wooden washbacks, but you're not allowed to explicitly add it into the mix. It has to be batch distilled on copper pot stills. They have to be copper. The pot itself has to be copper. The rest of the still doesn't have to be, but it's rare that it all isn't copper. And it has to be matured for 3 years and 1 day in oak barrels. The 3 years and 1 day rule is a European-wide rule. There's a set of regulations called EC 110/2008, which will say it has to be 3 years and a day in an oak tank or oak vessel up to 700 litres. So 700 litres is the largest cask you can have, but in Scotland they have to be oak as well. There are other rules surrounding that, so they've recently allowed tequila barrels to be used, but there are some fruit brandies, etc., that you're not allowed to use for maturing Scotch whisky in. So most Scotch whiskies in Scotland are run by accountants and commercial directors, and over the last 50 years, this has driven a drive towards efficiencies in production. And what that means is that almost every distillery in Scotland will use pot still malt. They'll use pale malt because it has maximum fermentability and the highest starch content. And that means the highest return in alcohol for them per pound or per dollar that they put into their grain bill. They use 100% distillers yeasts, and there's 3 or 4 main yeasts on the market that people will use. And they use these because they give very, very fast fermentation. You'll get full attenuation up to 8.5% alcohol in around about 40 hours. And they have massive resilience to changes in pH, changes in temperature, osmotic pressure, and ability to grow in quite high alcohol environments as well. So this is typically done in an adiabatic fashion as well. So you'll pitch between 16 and 20 degrees Celsius, depending on the season, and you'll let fermentation free rise up to around 33 to 35 degrees Celsius, which it will reach at about 40 hours. Industry standard is about 44 hours fermentation, and a lot of the smaller distilleries and the distilleries out on Islay, especially because they have peated malt, they take longer to ferment. But a lot of the craft distillers are moving towards longer fermentations because it gives a bit more complexity. The industry is absolutely dominated by ex-bourbon barrels, and that's because you can get them for under £100 each. An ex-sherry hogshead at the moment is about £750. So as you can imagine, if you're filling tens of thousands of casks a year, this is going to make a huge difference to your bottom line. I've added a little aside here at the bottom, which is just the scale of Scotch whisky distilleries. So there's quite a few big distilleries. The grain distilleries are all bigger than the malt whisky distilleries, but the biggest malt whisky distillery at the moment is Glenlivet, who have just undergone a huge expansion. But the drive for economics means that if they were to just be able to extract an extra 0.5% from their malt, that is the equivalent of 830 barrels of product per year, which is more than Holyrood's current production level, which is just absolutely phenomenal. You can see why the industry has been driven by these efficiencies. It's also driven driven maltsters to go for lower protein, higher starch varieties as well, which I believe may have an influence on the final product too. The connoisseurs will, there's a typical view that 1960s, early 1970s, and prior to that, the whiskey was of a different quality as to what it was today, and there's a few underlying impressions as to what leads to that, and they are floor maltings and direct firing of stills. So floor maltings were absolutely synonymous pre-1960s. A lot of distilleries would have had their own floor maltings. That's largely moved towards pneumatic large-scale maltsters like Crisp today. And if, for instance, you were the size of Glenlivet, you would need acres and acres and acres of floor maltings in order to fulfill what they need anyway. So it would be largely impossible to do. But the floor malting techniques that the maltsters would have used would have been different depending on the distillery they were at. For instance, at the end of the germination phase, which is about 4 or 5 days, the maltster may pile the green malt into the corner before loading it into the kiln, and this may have led to some stewing and pre-caramelization reactions going on inside the malt. When the malt was loaded into the kiln, you may have got hot spots in the kiln, so you may have got some brown or dark chocolate malts deriving within the kiln as well. These have largely been eliminated by homogeneity in the pneumatic maltings. So the other big difference is direct fired stills. So direct fired stills have largely died out. They're only really grandfathered in the industry now. There's only a few distilleries still doing direct firing. And part of the reason of that is because it's vastly inefficient compared to steam heated stills, and it's much more expensive as well. The bottoms on these direct fired stills are 5/8 of an inch thick, so about 15 mil thick copper, and there's the rummager inside, which is a bunch of chains that just get spun around slowly, and this is to stop burning sticking onto the still, and these chains need to be replaced every few years as well. Steam heated stills are synonymous now. Much lower temperatures. So steam heating in the still, if for instance the steam's running at 2.5 bar, then you're probably getting 140 degrees Celsius inside the pot, whereas there'll be hot spots inside a direct firing still which are 400, 500, 600 degrees Celsius, so causing caramelization, causing Maillard, causing all sorts of burning reactions going on in there as well. So what we've seen over the past 60 years is a homogenization of the industry somewhat towards pneumatic malts and pneumatic maltings and steam heated stills. And what this has partially led to is a lot of distilleries talking about the shape of their still and their water, because that's vastly all they've really got to go on is those two things, because they're not employing the skill of floor maltings and they haven't got any other differences to go by. Where we are different as Holyrood Distillery is we are not driven by efficiencies. So Holyrood Distillery is a new distillery located in the city centre of Edinburgh. So this picture on the top left is our visitor centre. Behind that is Holyrood Park, where Arthur's Seat with the extinct volcano sits in the middle of Edinburgh, so it's literally on the edge of the park. With it being an urban site, it has unique difficulties. The site itself is very constrained. It's surrounded on 3 sides residential and the 4th side by a police station. The building itself is very narrow as well, so it's only just over 20 feet wide. And we've managed to fit our entire distillery in a linear fashion within that, suited to tourism as well, so tours can go through and see the entire operation in a linear fashion. And it's been built to be a visitor centre. The visitor centre hasn't been retrofitted into an existing distillery, so it's disabled friendly, etc. as well. With it being such a small site, all of our maturation of stock is off-site at our warehouse, which is around 10 miles away from our distillery. Our production ideals, our ethos, largely stem out of an experiment which David Robertson, who's one of our founding directors, picture of him on the top right there, and this picture is quite poignant as well. It was to do with an experiment that we undertook back in, it was either 2016 or 2017, where we did 12 mashes with specialty malts, different specialty malts, to produce a single sherry butt of 12 different styles of spirit. And we found very interesting results. And largely what's what's come of that is our production methodology at Holyrood Distillery. What David's drinking in this picture here is what's been coined a Flying Scotsman. So this is first runnings off the mash tun at about 1090, so about what's that, 22 Plato. So hot, around about 60 degrees, mixed with new make spirit, straight up, well, just off the still. It's absolutely delicious. So if anyone is a distiller out there and gets the opportunity to do this, there's not many other places you can do this rather than in the distillery. So Holyrood Distillery's production approach is to use high proportions of specialty malt because we are all about delivering flavour. Additionally to that, we're using different yeasts as well. So we're not just using Scotch whisky distillers yeasts, we're using quite a high variety of brewers and wine yeasts as well, because we want to augment and create different flavours as well. We create different styles of spirit throughout the year, which I'll come back to, but we're not just sticking to the same methodology, not necessarily the same fermentation, not necessarily the same cut points on our distillation, and they will have different wood policies as well in order to match the different flavors which we're trying to create. So inside the distillery, it's a relatively small distillery, but especially by Scotch whisky standards, by world standards, it's probably not so small. It's a 1 ton mash, so 2,200 pounds, 8-foot diameter mash tun, semi-lauter mash tun, so relatively traditional. And I'll come back to what makes it a lot easier for us to do these trials rather than bigger distilleries in Scotland as well. That's our production team on the bottom left there. That's Ollie, Elizabeth and Elliot in pre-COVID happier times where they could be within 2 meters of each other. So inside our distillery as well, we have a blackboard at our mash tun, at our washbacks and at our stills, and it tells visitors to the distillery what we're doing on that particular day. So we're very open about what we're doing, and we do chop and change our production throughout the year as well. This is the rest of our distillery. So where the photographer is in some of these photos, the ones looking in the washback at the middle photo at the top there, the photographer is against the wall. So this is the full width of our entire distillery. One side of the distillery is dedicated to the visitor centre and the other side is dedicated to production. We also have a ground floor below this as well. So we've got 6 washbacks on site. The washbacks are double stacked, so we've got washbacks downstairs. And we've just got a pair of copper pot stills. Marketeers will tell you that the shape of the still is because of X, Y, and Z, because they need to. I always like to say that the shape and size of our stills is because if they were any wider, they wouldn't fit through the door. If they were any taller, they would go through the roof. And if they were any shorter, you'd hit your head on them as you're going through the distillery. But the stills do give good separation. They're very, very tall stills. They're the second tallest stills in Scotland. They do give good separation of congeners in there as well. What's relatively or rarely talked about in the industry is quite an important factor, which is how you drive the stills. So if you do a slow distillation or a fast distillation, which can have a profound effect on the flavour as well. So a slow distillation will give a cleaner product because you're getting more reflux over the course of the run, and you'll get a more complex product if you have a shorter distillation run. A typical distillation run for us is about 5, 6, maybe 7 hours on our spirit still. They are steam heated because, as I said, we're residential. So just behind the windows behind the still there is somebody's back garden. So you wouldn't want direct fired stills in this sort of area. And process engineers are moving away largely from direct firing stills now. It's much more dangerous, much more expensive. What we're trying to do is create 4 different styles of spirit, and we believe we can do this by mimicking the results of floor maltings effectively. So creating new make spirits with specialty malts are mimicking what you would have got from a floor maltings, but in a more consistent style. So the 4 product styles that we're creating throughout the year are smoky, spicy, fruity, floral, and sweet. Smoky is dominated by peated malt, so it's 100% peated malt that we get from Crisp at around about 55 ppm. It's not only driven by this though, so all of our 4 profiles have different yeast used in them as well. So while peated malt is the main thing that we change, we will be changing our yeasts in our smoky whiskey as well to deliver other other phenols and spicy characteristics. Our specialty malts are largely focused towards the spicy and the sweet styles. The spicy more using the brown malts, and the sweet using the caramel and crystal malts. Inside our distillery, so now onto the ground floor of the distillery, this is how we mash in. So there's Rutele mashing in there at the distillery, and these bags were the ones that became the spirit which she's analysed for us in the last few months as well. Because we're a small distillery, we can buy bags of 25 kilos of pre-milled grist on site and tip them straight in to our mashing procedure. Any bigger distilleries don't really have the option for doing this. They have big silos, they have big conveyors. They don't have intake hoppers like this unless they were loading straight into their silos. So it becomes much more difficult for a bigger distillery to do this. We're using high proportions of specialty malt as well. So a typical brewer might only use 5% chocolate malt on a good day. We're using up to 30% chocolate malt and caramel malt in these. So big proportions. You'll see the different colors of wort that you get as well. So there's a wash sample and a wort sample there in the middle. Great variety in color and in flavor of these as well. When you're using 30% chocolate malt, your wort and your wash aren't the nicest tasting things. They're quite overpowering. But our ethos is to run the distillery a little bit more like a Jamaican rum distillery is run, rather than a Scotch whisky distillery is run. So Scotch whisky distilleries are run to produce the same product day in, day out, whereas Jamaican rum distilleries will produce different products throughout the year in different quantities, and they will then blend those together in different proportions. So for most of the year, they might create something light and sweet, a sort of a white, light, easy drinking rum, whereas for a few weeks of the year, they might produce something which is intensely heavy in congeners, so probably undrinkable on its own, but they will use that in small quantities to add complexity to their products. So that's largely what we're looking at doing here. So we're looking at creating high intensity flavor in smaller batches of product, which we could then blend together to create complexity in our products. The processing issues within the distillery are not numerous, but they are notable. Lightering does get more difficult with these specialty malts because you are destroying the husk. If you're doing chocolate malt, your lightering does slow down. So if you were looking to do a mash in 4 or 5 hours, you would really struggle to do that. The final gravity translates exactly as you would imagine. So as you saw in Rutele's presentation, the rate of fermentation doesn't really slow down between beginning and end, but the obviously you get unfermentables that are left in there which don't ferment out. So your final gravity is obviously a lot higher. So we are getting a range of gravities. Our 100% pale malt mashes will be a final gravity of 4 below, so 996, which is minus 1 Plato, or minus 1 Plato. And our high chocolate malt concentrations will be anywhere between 1005 and 1008. So still dry by beer standards, but much higher than you'd get from 100% distiller's malt. The flavor carryover, what we were initially worried about is creating the world's most delicious pot ale, which is obviously not what you're trying to do. Pot ale costs money to dispose of, and it's the bane of most distilleries' lives to get rid of pot ale, which is pot ale on its own is 60% of your entire production, and spent lees is another 30%. So 90% of what you're producing is liquid effluent at a distillery. And if you're putting too much flavour into that and none of it into your product, then you've got a real problem. We do get a lot of flavour carryover into our product. Quantifying that will become work for the future. The one note that's quite interesting on this is that the behaviour of distillation. One thing I didn't mention earlier is that you are allowed to use one processing aid in Scotch whisky, which is antifoam, and it's used typically in fermentation and in your wash distillation, your first distillation. They're protein targeting antifoams, so they can work amazingly well. But you'll see in the picture here on the left hand side, this is in our wash still. which has got glass manways on it as well, so you can see into the wash still and into the spirit still as they're boiling. We get a very, very difficult to deal with foam forming, and protein targeting antifoams do nothing to stop this. I believe this is due to caramels within the wash that are left in there. When you want to break these down, you normally lower the heat of the still, raise it, lower it, raise it, lower it, raise it a few times in order to break the head of that fob. Doing that with this fob on the still does absolutely nothing, and it just remains there. So it's really, really hard to deal with, and it means you can't run your still quite as quickly as you would like to. From a production environment, you want to get your wash still done in 4 or 5 hours. So when it's a high proportion of specialty malt, it may take longer to go through that. We do get these flavors coming through. Typically what you'd imagine as well, with the crystal malt additions and caramel malt additions, you are getting the notes that you would expect: caramel, butterscotch, sweet malty flavors, and with the likes of chocolate malt, you are getting the roasted and toasted flavors that you would expect coming through. Part of the ambition for this, the project with Rutele and with Crisp, is that we're trying to create malts that deliver maximum flavor for distilling, especially. So there's very, very little research done into the carryover of flavor during distillation. There's an eternity of literature on specialty malts in beer, but creating low volatile flavors that don't distill is not really in our interest to do. The other aspect is the detrimental effects of these of some of these flavors on yeast behavior as well. If we are adding too much chocolate malt, does it impede the growth of the yeast or the fermentation of the yeast, or does it influence the yeast in order to produce what a higher alcohol, for instance? And producing higher alcohols is not of great interest to most of the industry, but it is of interest to us because these higher alcohols, when combined with acids, for instance lactic acid that is produced in some of these reactions as well, and in late stage fermentation from intrinsic infection, you get esterification. So creating these fruity characters and creating these complex fruitiness from different higher alcohols and different organic acids may have a very interesting effect on the products that we're trying to create as they age in the cask over many, many years. So that brings us to the end of my presentation. If Colin is there, I'll be happy to take any questions as well.
I am. Rutele, can you join us again? And if I could also invite our technical director, Dr. David Griggs, up. Awesome. Can you stop sharing your screen, please, Jack?
No. There you go.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you to both of you for two superb presentations. We've got time for questions, certainly, and we have a few coming in. First of all, here's one from Fergus Clark. Hello, Fergus. Nice to see you're on. Are you planning, so this is for Rutele, are you planning to look at different types of mash filtration to improve wort yield on higher concentrations of darker grains?
So in laboratory, we tried to filtrate with vacuum, but that was just a fail because we get very slurry, just a slur. So I think we have no plans for now to change our filtration, but the ultimate goal is for a distillery to be able to filtrate. So I think what Jack is doing is more important, because this is just my laboratory experiments and we will have to transfer it to the big scale. And then what was the second part of that?
Also one here from Ken Duncan. Jack might have answered it in his presentation. You've mentioned that roasted flavor components can limit fermentation. Can you expand on this? So I guess just the mechanisms behind that.
Yeah, so in roasting, two components, furfural and hydroxymethyl furfural. They are very nice, pleasant smelling, but there are studies that they inhibit yeast growth and fermentation alcohol production. So we will have to investigate how that affects our yeast.
Interesting.
So there's a paper written by, or a review article written by George Bathgate, December 2018, which goes into talking about furfural quite a lot, I believe, as well. I think you sent that to me, Colin, a few months ago. So it's potentially variety dependent as well. So you are going to get, for instance, more of it from Marciulionyte.
Yeah. I mean, there are not. It's not just in the specialty malts in terms of the roasting, but the actual there are varietal differences as well. So, which hasn't been explored a lot of late. But there's an interesting area for exploration for distillation flavour also. Cool. Okay. One for you, Jack, on the other end of the process when you're producing the waste. So specialty malts pot ale is not the friend of the farmer or of the anaerobic digester. And how do you kind of tackle that challenge? And
we pay someone to
take it away.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
They give us a transfer notice and they take it away.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm assuming there's not an awful lot that can be done in that area, or
no. I mean, luckily we're a small producer. We're not producing millions of litres of this stuff a year, so we can kind of. Oh, sorry, my phone's just fallen over. We can kind of get away with small disposal of these things. So if it does go into a huge anaerobic digester, it won't make quite as much difference as a big distillery would.
Okay, fair enough. Buster Grant asks to either of you, do you recommend keeping separate feints and tails for each blend of coloured malt? Would you expect flavour carryover into a pale wash distillation, for example?
Absolutely, yes. So it's as different from pale malt, low wines or feints as a peated run would be. So you will not get a huge amount of complexity the first time you do a chocolate mash once it goes through your distillation, but you have to build up feints for that. So 3 or 4 different distillation runs. So you'll see a lag in flavour development as it's going through the process. But absolutely keep them in different feints.
I'm not sure if you mentioned it in your presentation, but how many mashes are you doing of one particular type? You're not chopping and changing every mash.
We have chopped and changed a little bit, but we look to do at least a week. So you look to do at least 5 mashes to build up complexity of flavour in that. So you're never really going to get perfect results from one mash.
Mm-hmm. And then you just have an IBC and you're storing that.
We have 2 receivers actually built in downstairs. So we've got a third runoff which we can take into IBC as well.
Okay.
We've got 2 different low wines receivers.
Great. One for Rutele from Sherwin in Canada. Is it worthwhile testing for non-volatiles in your experiments?
That could be interesting, but we would expect if they're non-volatile, they wouldn't distill, so they wouldn't go into our spirit. But also, so non-volatiles could be sugars, so sweetness. They could be tannins for astringency, but I would expect them to stay in the pot ale. So that would be for cows.
Okay. I was speaking to an American distiller. This is a lot more common over there in terms of taking beer almost and distilling it out. But one specific distillery in Seattle who have washes produced for them that are like beer but without the hops. And their fermentations tend to finish around about 10-10. And that residual sugar, they believe, does contribute to flavour, but it's probably the flavour active compounds from caramelization rather than the actual sugar per se that's transferring across.
I think non-volatiles would be really important for beer as it stays in the beer. So you get all those non-fermentable dextrins, which gives you mouthfeel and sugars and sweetness, and also that astringency. But in whiskey, I think they are kept in the still.
They're kept in the still. Yeah. It's a fantastic area of research, and that all this seeing these flavors come across the still that we never thought that they would come across. One for Jack. We'd like to know, have you done any experiments for the limitation of addition to create carryover flavor to new make?
So is this using 1%, 2%, 3% specialty malt?
Yeah, so I'm assuming that's round about sort of percentages of additions.
Yeah,
you've been investigating that as well.
So we've been in our university. We've seen that 5% is definitely enough to feel the difference. We could go lower. We could investigate lower, but we kind of want a bit of flavor, not just
Yeah,
So our method is to blend these products back in later on as well. So the maximum flavour that we can create in a small percentage of liquid means that we could, in theory, then go and produce a product which is 100% pale malt for a number of months to increase our efficiencies. So if we can get away with doing it on a short scale, then that's what we're all about.
It's almost like, in a way, it's like multi-shot gin production, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Almost exactly the same.
Good stuff. Another question for Jack from Thomas Taylor. Are you aware which components of the wash are responsible for the increased foaming observed in distillation in the high roasted malt batches? And does the increased foaming, is it observed in fermentation as well as distillation?
So no, we're not aware of what it is. We've only seen it a few times, quite late on. So we haven't really analysed it. It doesn't affect the fermentation though. So the protein targeting antifoams work in the fermentation, and I believe it's as if you were boiling caramel in a pot, you would see these bubbles start forming. You don't get that from treacle just sitting there. You get it when these things boil. So I believe it's coming when it's really, really hot. It doesn't happen in fermentation though, but it's something we will look into eventually, but just haven't had time yet.
No time yet. Okay, fair enough. For either of you, do you try varying, or are you going to try varying fermentation conditions to maximize yield, increased pitching rates, or varying temperature profiles, for example?
So we can't do that at Holyrood. We can only do adiabatic fermentation. We don't have cooling jackets on the washbacks. We can pitch at a lower temperature. It would lead to a longer fermentation, but we'd still only be able to free rise our fermentation.
Okay. And the fundamental problem, I suppose, really is to do with fermentability more than anything else, isn't it?
Yeah.
So the perhaps lack of or dilution of enzymes. So it might be about trying to affect enzyme levels in other ways in terms of the.
So I guess the way to do that would be to use high DP malt in your grain bill, or use the 15% pale malt or thereabouts, minimize it.
But as you've already noted, it's about that balance of flavour versus yield, rather than necessarily absolutely trying to maximise the yield of this.
If there are unfermentables in there, or if there's anything in there after distiller's yeast has had at it, then it is unfermentable.
Yes.
Pretty much.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. One for Dave, I would say. There are many old varieties of barley held by the John Innes Centre. Are you trialling flavour input from any varieties older than Marciulionyte?
Good question. Brings us very nicely to the next subject, to the next
webinar
in 2 weeks' time, Colin, isn't it? So, so we're going to be talking about our programme of reintroduction of heritage varieties in 2 weeks' time. So I'm going to myself will be talking with Sarah DeVos and Chris Rideout from John Innes. So a little bit about how we've gone about reintroducing these varieties, and then some of the attributes that come with them. So I think I'll hang off answering that one for.
You'll hang off until you have to come back in 2 weeks' time to get that one answered.
Get the answer in 2 weeks' time. So, but just to pick up a little bit on Rutele's work. I mean, a couple of weeks ago, if you're on the webinar, you would have seen Hannah talking about our specialty malt plant. And Rutele's work is really critical to our new product development that we're going to be carrying out on that plant, because we've got such tight control of conditions as opposed to a roasting drum. So once Rutele's found the sweet spot of temperature and time, then we're going to be transferring that knowledge across to the SMP, and hopefully for Jack, we'll be able to produce him a bespoke product which carries all the flavours that we've identified as being desirable in distilled spirit. So watch this space.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, we're out of questions there, I think. I'll just double check the chat window. Yes, we are indeed. Thank you very much for your presentations. As Rutele mentioned, this is just the end of year 1 of 4, but amazing power of work that's been done already. Thank you so much, and we look forward to tasting new make spirit together when we all can, and exploring these flavors even more. And someone's just asked, the next webinar, yeah, it's in 2 weeks' time at the same time, so 3 p.m. British Summer Time, Thursday, the
25th.
The 25th. Thanks, as I check the calendar. Thursday 25th, but we'll be putting notice out on the mailing list. And remember that you can watch this presentation if you missed bits of it, or if any of the signal dropped out. You'll get it on YouTube and on our website in the next few days. So we'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your time, everyone. And we do hope you'll join us again. Thanks, guys.